This presentation looks at the dangers of excessive government spending. We've already seen that government spending can be justified to provide public goods and merit goods, but that the governments of developed economies usually spend more than they earn in taxation, and so that they usually have a budget deficit. This is considered normal. We now have to look at the situation where government spending gets out of control, gets beyond any reasonable limit, and see what that reasonable limit can be, how that reasonable limit can be measured. And what are the dangers when the government spends too much? So we know that government is part of aggregate demand, government spending is part of aggregate demand, and that it contributes to national income. So government spending contributes to national income just as much as consumer spending, or firms' investment spending, or spending by foreigners on buying exports. So when can we say that government spending is too much, is too great? Well, we already know that governments usually run a budget deficit. They are spending more than they are gaining in taxation. And this means that they have to borrow the difference between G and T by selling government bonds. Now, this budget deficit, we know, contributes to the national debt. So when we want to ask ourselves how much government spending is too much, we can look at the budget deficit every year in comparison to the GDP of that year, or we can look at the national debt that we have accumulated in comparison to GDP. Both these ratios give us some idea of when government spending and borrowing is getting out of control. So a typically measured ratio is national debt as a percentage of GDP. All nations monitor this ratio. All economies monitor this ratio. In developed economies, ratios of around 60% are seen as acceptable. Some would argue that even this is too much. But if the national debt of the country is 60% of its GDP at that moment, then this is seen as acceptable. 90% is seen as dangerous, and anything over 100% would be seen as critical and needing emergency action to reduce it. So we can have some kind of measurement of when government spending is too much and when it's becoming dangerous. So let's look at what are the dangers of excessive government spending and a fiscal policy which is out of control. The danger of a high national debt, a national debt which is, shall we say, 90% of GDP or over 100% of GDP, is that this level of government borrowing will lead to banks charging higher interest rates when they buy government bonds. In other words, they will be willing to buy government bonds, but only if the government pays a higher level of interest. This will cause raised interest rates throughout the economy, which may cause consumer spending and investment spending to fall, leading to a recession. So one danger of excessive government spending and borrowing is that it will provoke a recession through raising interest rates. There is, of course, another danger, which is that if foreign investors believe that government will have to create new money or raise taxes in order to pay off the national debt, in other words, the opinion of the foreign investors is that the national debt is too high, they will, of course, try to get out of that country in terms of any investments they have in that country. They will sell assets and generally disinvest. So if they own any shares in companies in that country, they will sell them. If they own bonds, they will sell them. If they own real property, they will sell that and invest somewhere else. There will be an outflow of financial capital, and there will be a drying up of foreign direct investment. all of this will lead to slower GDP growth in the future in that country. So a second danger is that foreign investors may lose confidence in the government's ability to repay the national debt. They may start to believe that the government's fiscal policy is irresponsible and out of control. And they will then disinvest, and this will lead to slower GDP growth rates in the future. The other danger, the third danger, is that government spending, which is too quick and too much, will cause demand pull inflation, especially when the economy is close to its full capacity. We can see this on this aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve. Here, government spending is causing the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right, when in fact the economy is close to its short-run full capacity, which we call Y star. So if the economy is close to Y star and the government increases its spending, there will be rapid demand pull inflation. So the three dangers of excessive government spending and an irresponsible fiscal policy are raised interest rates, a loss of confidence by foreign investors, and demand pull inflation. Any one of these could happen. Also, we have to bear in mind that government spending has a smaller multiplier effect than consumer spending per pound spent. So if consumers spend an extra pound, that has a much larger multiplier effect on the economy than if the government spends a pound. The reasons for this we don't need to go into, but it is usually true. And so government spending is criticized by many who believe in smaller government. They think that the role of government is to provide stability through laws. They believe government should spend as little as possible and also tax as little as possible. So this is another criticism of excessive government spending and a fiscal policy which is out of control. Many people believe that this actually slows down economic growth because the government is taking taxes from people and spending the money itself, whereas in fact, if we allowed people to keep their income and spend it, this would have a much larger multiplier effect. There is also the possibility that governments spend to increase their power and influence, not because it helps the economy. So this is another criticism of excessive government spending. So to summarize, we have looked at different reasons why too much government spending may be bad for the economy. In the first case, too much government spending may cause interest rates to go up. Secondly, it may cause an outflow of financial capital as foreign investors lose confidence in the economy and the fiscal policy of the government. Thirdly, it may cause demand pull inflation. Fourthly, government spending may actually slow down economic growth because the government spending multiplier is smaller than the household spending multiplier. Fifthly, there is a sense that governments are just spending to increase their power and influence in the economy and not for any actual economic reason. So we can measure the level of government spending and borrowing by measuring the ratio of national debt to GDP. And if this ratio is seen as becoming too large, that is an indication that fiscal policy is out of control and should be restricted or changed.